The walls may crumble, the windows may shatter, the paint may peel away, but the memories, the screams, the whispers, the blood, they remain, echoing through time. And nowhere in America does this feel more real, more terrifying than on the dark windswept hilltops of Louisville, Kentucky. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than an abandoned ruin, a hulking, decaying building looming over the trees with broken windows staring blankly into the night. But ask anyone who's been inside, and they'll tell you Waverly Hills Sanatorium is far more than an old hospital. It is a place where thousands of men, women, and children died. It is a place where hope turned to despair, where medicine became torture, where the thin line between life and death blurred into something far more sinister. And today, it is said to be one of the most haunted locations in the United States, a place where shadows walk, screams echo from empty hallways, and unseen hands brush against you in the dark. This is the story of Waverly Hills, a story of disease, of death, of horror, and of the restless souls who are said to still roam its endless corridors. To understand Waverly Hills, we need to step back into the early 1900s, a time when the United States faced one of the deadliest epidemics in its history, tuberculosis. They called it the White Plague. It spread silently, ripping through towns and cities, leaving coughing, pale, feverish victims in its wake. There was no cure, no antibiotics, no real treatment. Once you caught it, the odds were against you, and in Louisville, the outbreak was so bad that an entire facility had to be built on a remote hill, isolated from the city, hidden from view, as if the dying could be tucked away where no one had to see them. That place became Waverly Hills, Sanatorium. From the very beginning, it was a house of suffering. Entire families were sent there, some never to return. Husbands and wives were separated. Children were taken from their parents. The moment you passed through its doors, you became part of a world that was half hospital, half prison, a place where you were meant to either heal or die. The first whispers of horror, the treatments inside, were often worse than the disease itself. Doctors tried experimental surgeries, cutting open chests to collapse infected lungs, filling them with air or chemicals. Patients were strapped to cold metal tables under bright lights, enduring procedures that today would be considered barbaric. Others were simply left to waste away in their beds, their coughs echoing through the halls, their last breaths carried off into the night. And when they died, as thousands did, they weren't carried out the front door. No, Waverly Hills had a secret, a long, dark, sloping tunnel built beneath the hospital. Officially, it was called the body chute. Staff used it to discreetly remove the dead so that patients still alive wouldn't see the endless parade of corpses leaving the building. But the patients knew. They heard the wheels creaking on the stretchers, the whispers of the orderlies, the silence that followed. The tunnel became a place of dread, a symbol of Waverly Hills, and today many claim it is the most haunted spot in the entire building, where footsteps echo, shadows dart, and cold, invisible fingers brush across your skin. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does this matter? Why should we care about an old, abandoned sanatorium in Kentucky? Because Waverly Hills is more than just a building. It is a reflection of a time in American history when fear ruled the country, when disease was seen as a death sentence, when the sick were cast away, out of sight, out of mind, left to die in institutions that became more like graveyards than hospitals. It is also a reminder that the past does not always stay in the past, that suffering leaves scars not just on people, but on places. And Waverly Hills, with its dark history and thousands of restless souls, may be one of those places where the scars never healed. Over the years, countless paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious thrill seekers have walked its halls. They report shadowy figures, disembodied voices, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Some leave shaken, Others refuse to ever return. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, Waverly Hills forces you to confront a terrifying question. What happens to a place when death becomes its only constant? Tonight we are stepping inside. We will walk the endless corridors where patients cough their last breaths. We will descend into the death tunnel, where thousands of bodies were wheeled into the night. We will climb to the upper floors, where nurses once worked tirelessly, and where some met their own tragic ends. And we will listen to the stories of those who claim the dead never left. This is not just a tale of ghosts. It is a tale of history, of a nation fighting an invisible enemy, of human suffering so great that it carved itself into the very walls of a building. Welcome to Waverly Hills, Sanatorium. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was a nation on the rise. Cities grew taller, railroads stretched farther, and technology promised a brighter future. But lurking in the shadows of this progress was an enemy far more powerful than any industrial advancement could defeat. Tuberculosis, known as the White Plague, it spread with merciless efficiency. A cough here, a sneeze there, and suddenly an entire household was infected. It did not discriminate. The rich, the poor, the young, the old, all were vulnerable. By the early 1900s, it was claiming more lives in America than any other disease. In fact, in some regions, 1 out of every 7 people who died had succumbed to tuberculosis. Louisville, Kentucky, was hit especially hard. Its humid climate and booming population made it a breeding ground for the illness. Entire neighborhoods were ravaged. Families buried loved ones in rapid succession, with funerals becoming so common they felt like part of daily life. Fear hung over the city like a dark cloud, and the cough of a neighbor was enough to send shivers down the spine. The city needed a solution, not just for the sick, but for the healthy who feared contamination. And so, in 1910, construction began on what would become one of the most infamous institutions in American history, Waverly Hills Sanatorium. The location was chosen carefully, a hill on the outskirts of Louisville, high above the polluted city air. Doctors believed wrongly, but with the best science of their time, that fresh air, sunlight, and isolation were the keys to fighting tuberculosis. The hills, breezes, and wide-open fields seemed ideal for this battle. But Waverly was not just a hospital. It was a world unto itself. To enter its grounds was to leave behind everything familiar. Patients who were admitted often never returned. Home families knew when they left their loved ones at the gates that they might never see them again. The original building was modest, a 2-story wooden structure meant to house about 40 patients. But it quickly became clear that 40 beds were not enough. Tuberculosis was spreading faster than anyone anticipated. The little sanatorium filled to capacity within months. Desperate, the city expanded. By the 1920s, Waverly Hills had transformed into a massive Gothic-style brick building with room for more than 400 patients. Its long, echoing corridors and imposing 5-story structure loomed like a fortress over the surrounding hills. For those who entered, Waverly was both a sanctuary and a sentence. Doctors promised treatment, but there was no cure. Families clung to hope, but in their hearts they knew the truth. Waverly was not just a hospital. It was a holding ground for the dying. The rules were strict. Patients were quarantined, cut off from the outside world. Letters were censored, visits restricted. Many patients were children who grew up never leaving the sanatorium's grounds, their entire childhoods spent within its walls to the outside world. Waverly was a beacon of hope, a place where doctors fought bravely against a deadly disease. But to those inside, it was something far darker, a world of isolation, despair, and death. Even in these early days, long before the legends of ghosts and curses, Waverly carried an aura of dread. Nurses spoke of the constant wailing from the wards, of sleepless nights filled with coughing that echoed through the building. Some claimed they felt uneasy walking the halls alone at night, as if unseen eyes were following them, and then there was the death toll. It grew quickly, year after year, until the sanatorium was overwhelmed, not just with the sick, but with the dead. Waverly would need a way to handle them discreetly, quietly, out of sight. But that horror belongs to another chapter. For now, the truth was simple. Waverly Hills had been born out of necessity, but from its very first days, it was more a house of sorrow than of healing. The early 1900s was an age of innovation. Automobiles were beginning to replace horses, electricity was illuminating homes, and airplanes had just begun to conquer the skies. But in the shadows of this progress lurked a silent killer that no machine, no invention, and no dream of the future could stop. Tuberculosis, they called it the White Plague. It earned its name from the ghostly pallor it gave its victims. The sunken cheeks, the hollow eyes, the thin skeletal frames. Unlike other illnesses, tuberculosis did not strike suddenly. It crept in slowly, whispering through the lungs until it consumed every breath. The disease was everywhere. Children coughed in classrooms, fathers came home pale and wheezing. Mothers hid their bloody handkerchiefs until it was too late. The statistics were staggering. Tuberculosis killed more people than cancer, influenza, or heart disease combined. In Louisville, Kentucky, the epidemic hit with terrifying force. Its humid climate became the perfect breeding ground for infection. Families watched helplessly as loved ones wasted away. It was not uncommon for multiple members of the same household to die within months of one another. Fear swept through the city like a second plague. A simple cough could empty an entire room. Neighbors shunned one another. Communities turned on the infected, branding them as outcasts, too dangerous to remain among the living. And so, in desperate need of containment, Louisville leaned heavily on the looming fortress at the top of the hill, Waverly Hills, Sanatorium. As the epidemic grew, so too did Waverly's population. The original 40-bed building was bursting at the seams. Men and women were crammed into every available space. Beds lined hallways, and waiting lists stretched on endlessly. Families begged for admittance, knowing it was their only chance, slim though it was, for survival. By the 1920s, Waverly Hills had transformed into a 5-story monolith of brick and concrete, with the capacity to house more than 400 patients at once. It had long, cavernous hallways lined with rooms, wards with wide porches where patients could be wheeled into the open air, and towering windows designed to let in as much sunlight as possible. From the outside it looked like progress, a modern marvel designed to battle the plague. But inside, it was a world of sorrow. Each bed carried a story, each hallway echoed with coughing, each room bore witness to suffering. Patients arrived with hope in their hearts, clinging to the promise of fresh air and treatment. But many never left alive. The moment you entered Waverly, you ceased to belong to the outside world. Patients were quarantined, separated from families, and left to live in near isolation. Visits were rare, and when they did occur, they were tightly controlled. The sanatorium became a city unto itself, with its own school for children, its own post office, and even its own farm to provide food. It was designed for long-term occupancy, because those who entered often remained for years. Trapped in a limbo between life and death, to many, Waverly was less a hospital and more a prison. You could look out across the trees and hills of Kentucky, see the city of Louisville shimmering in the distance, but you could not return to it. You were cut off, your life beyond those walls severed, your fate tied to the air you breathed within. Waverly's corridors, the numbers are staggering even today. At its peak, Waverly Hills witnessed hundreds of deaths every year. Some say as many as 63,000 souls passed through its doors, their final breaths taken within its walls. Imagine that for a moment. Tens of thousands of lives extinguished in one building. The sheer volume of death left a mark not only on the people who lived and worked there, but on the very structure itself. The air felt heavy with grief. The walls soaked up despair like a sponge. Nurses spoke of how the atmosphere changed after a death, how the room would feel colder, how silence would settle heavily in the halls until the next cough, the next scream, the next death shattered it again. One of the most heartbreaking sights of Waverly was the children's ward. Dozens of young boys and girls lived there, many without parents, many too sick to play or laugh. Those who still had energy would play with makeshift toys, their games echoing against the walls, a bittersweet reminder of innocence against a backdrop of despair. Some of the most famous ghost stories of Waverly come from this ward. Tales of children still seen running in the halls, laughter echoing through empty rooms, and the sound of a bouncing ball when no living soul is there to play. Even in life, the children of Waverly existed in a limbo, their world defined by medicine, suffering, and the faint fading hope of recovery. In death, perhaps they lingered, unwilling to leave the only home they had ever known by the 1930s and 40s. Waverly Hills was infamous across America. To some, it was a place of medical progress, a facility where doctors experimented with new treatments, desperately seeking a cure. To others, it was a place of horror, a grim fortress where the sick went to die. Whispers of the strange happenings inside the sanatorium began to spread. Stories of patients seeing shadows at their bedside. Nurses swearing they heard voices calling their names in empty hallways. Families telling of loved ones who wrote letters describing a darkness in the building before they died. The legend of Waverly Hills was already taking root, not yet the haunted asylum it would become, but a place where the sheer weight of suffering created an atmosphere unlike any other. And so, as the years passed, Waverly Hills filled with more patients, more experiments, and more death. The disease showed no mercy, and neither did the building. The sanatorium became both a sanctuary of hope and a tomb of despair, and the next chapter of its story would only grow darker. When people think of hospitals, they think of healing. They think of doctors saving lives, of medicine curing illness, of recovery and hope. But inside the towering walls of Waverly Hills, hope was often an illusion, because in the early 1900s, there was no cure for tuberculosis. No antibiotics, no miracle drug, no simple surgery that could save the dying. All doctors had were theories, and many of those theories led to treatments that were not only ineffective, they were brutal. In the beginning, treatments seemed almost harmless. Doctors believed that clean air and sunshine could slow the spread of tuberculosis. Patients were wheeled onto massive open-air porches. No matter the weather, photographs from Waverly show row after row of patients lying in hospital beds on balconies, their bodies wrapped in blankets, snow piling up on their chests as they struggled to breathe. Others sat outside in the blistering Kentucky summer, sweating under the weight of their illness. The idea was simple. If the lungs were exposed to constant fresh air, they might heal themselves. Patients were forced to spend hours, even days outside. Some endured freezing winters with the wind cutting across their faces, while others withstood humid summers that left them drenched in sweat. It was called heliotherapy. It sounded scientific, but for the thousands forced to endure it, it was little more than slow torture. As the years went on, doctors grew more desperate. They began experimenting with more aggressive treatments, procedures that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. One of the most infamous was called collapse therapy. The idea was that if one lung could be collapsed, it would give the infected tissue a chance to rest and heal. To do this, doctors would insert needles between the ribs, forcing air chemicals, or even surgical sponges into the chest cavity. Patients described the feeling as unbearable, as though they were suffocating, drowning inside their own bodies. Some surgeries involved removing entire sections of ribs to permanently collapse the lung. The sound of saws and scalpels became a chilling soundtrack to life at Waverly. Many patients never survived these procedures. For them, the treatment became a death sentence. For those whose tuberculosis spread aggressively, weakening their ability to breathe, there were machines. One of the most feared was the iron lung, a massive coffin-like device that encased the patient's body while a pump forced their lungs to expand and contract. Patients would spend hours, even days, locked inside these machines, staring up at the ceiling, unable to move, unable to escape. For some, it became their entire world. Nurses would whisper that the sound of the machines, the hissing, the clanking, the relentless rhythm of forced breathing echoed through the halls like a mechanical heartbeat. Other devices were even more experimental, designed to shock, freeze, or burn away infection. The patients became test subjects in a desperate war against a disease no one understood. By the 1930s and 40s, surgery had become a grim reality for many. One of the most extreme procedures was called thoracoplasty. Doctors would surgically remove several ribs, sometimes up to 8, to permanently collapse the lung cavity. The results were grotesque. Patients were left with sunken chests, their bodies permanently deformed. Many did not survive the surgery, and those who did often lived in agony. Another treatment involved inserting balloons into the lungs and inflating them. A horrifying procedure done under rudimentary anesthesia, often with the patient still conscious enough to feel pressure, pain, and fear. Doctors called it progress. Patients called it hell. Imagine walking down the hallways of Waverly Hills during this time. The building echoed with the sounds of coughing, crying, and screaming. From one room came the rattling breath of a patient in their final hours. From another, the muffled cries of someone strapped to a surgical table, enduring a procedure that may or may not save their life. Down the hall, children whimpered as nurses forced them onto balconies in the freezing cold, their tiny bodies shivering violently under layers of blankets. The smell of antiseptic and sickness lingered everywhere. The hospital reeked of despair, and yet, through it all, there was a sense of routine. For the doctors and nurses, this was just another day at Waverly Hills, another patient, another experiment, another chance, however slim, to beat back the plague. To some, these treatments were symbols of hope. Families clung to the idea that the doctors were doing everything possible, no matter how extreme, to save their loved ones. A few patients did survive, managing to live long enough for new medical breakthroughs to finally bring relief. But for the majority, the treatments were little more than drawn-out suffering. They endured surgeries, devices, and therapies that only prolonged their agony. And when the end came, it came quietly, swiftly, and often without dignity. It was this brutal combination of hope mingled with horror, of medicine laced with suffering, that gave Waverly Hills its unique atmosphere. An atmosphere that many believe still lingers today. Because when so much pain is endured in one place, when so much suffering is concentrated within 4 walls, it does not simply disappear. It imprints itself, leaving behind echoes that defy explanation. It is important to remember that the doctors at Waverly were not monsters. They were men and women fighting a war they could not win. Tuberculosis was a death sentence, and in their desperation, they tried anything, no matter how extreme, to save lives. But the price of that desperation was high. Thousands endured treatments that broke their bodies and their spirits. And for many, death came not from the disease itself, but from the very attempts to cure it. Today, those treatments are remembered not as cures, but as horrors. And the ghosts of Waverly, it is said, still carry the scars. Every hospital has its secrets, But at Waverly Hills Sanatorium, the secret was not hidden in the operating rooms, nor buried in the medical records. It was built into the very foundation of the hill itself, a long sloping tunnel that would come to define the building's legacy of horror. Officially, it was called the service tunnel. To the staff, it was the body chute, and to the patients, it was the most dreaded place on earth, stretching nearly 500 feet down the hillside. The tunnel was made of cold concrete, with steep steps running alongside a set of tracks where gurneys could be wheeled up and down. It connected the hospital at the top of the hill to the railroad and roads far below. On paper, its purpose was practical. Supplies could be brought up to the hospital without trudging up the steep hill. Workers could come and go. And yes, the dead could be discreetly removed without parading them in front of the still living patients. But in practice, the tunnel became a conveyor belt of death. Day after day, bodies of the fallen were strapped to gurneys, covered in sheets, and wheeled down its dark passage. The sick above knew exactly what those creaking wheels meant. Another friend, another roommate, another family member was gone. The silence of the tunnel was broken only by the squeak of metal wheels, the shuffle of orderlies' boots, and sometimes by whispers that no one could explain. For those who remained alive, the tunnel was a symbol of despair. Even if they never saw it with their own eyes, they could feel its presence. It was the shadow that hung over every cough, every fever, every bloody handkerchief. They knew that if their treatments failed, if their bodies gave in, their final journey would not be through the hospital's front doors, but down into that dark chute, wheeled into silence, rolled into oblivion, never to return. Children whispered about it in hushed voices. Adults prayed not to end up there. But thousands did. The death toll at Waverly was staggering. Some estimates suggest that at its height, dozens of patients were dying every week. That meant dozens of bodies, week after week, year after year, carried down the chute. Imagine the sheer weight of grief compressed into that narrow passageway. The tunnel became more than just a physical structure. It became a monument to suffering, a place where death itself seemed to take up residence. Even staff, hardened by constant exposure to sickness and loss, admitted the tunnel unnerved them. Orderlies reported feeling watched as if invisible. Eyes followed them as they wheeled their grim cargo down the slope. Nurses claimed to hear footsteps echoing behind them, only to turn and find the tunnel empty. It's no surprise that today, the death tunnel is considered the most haunted part of Waverly Hills. Paranormal investigators describe overwhelming dread the moment they step inside. Visitors report hearing the unmistakable squeak of gurney wheels on concrete, even though the tunnel has long been abandoned. Others swear they hear whispers in the dark, voices calling their names, or low moans that seem to rise from the walls themselves. Some have seen shadows darting across the tunnel, shapes darker than the darkness itself. A few even claim to have been touched, icy fingers brushing against their arms, a sudden tug at their clothing, a cold hand on the back of their neck. One investigator recalled setting up recording equipment in the chute. When they played it back, a chilling voice could be heard whispering, "Get out." To walk the tunnel today is to step back in time. The walls are cracked, the air is damp, and the silence is suffocating. Each step downward feels heavier than the last, as though the weight of history is pressing against you. Halfway down, the light from the hospital above fades, replaced by shadows that seem to close in from every side. The echoes of your footsteps bounce back at you, distorted, as though something unseen is following. By the time you reach the bottom, you understand what the patients must have felt. You understand why the living feared it, and why the dead may still linger there. Because the tunnel was not just a passage for bodies, it was a passage for souls. The death tunnel remains one of the most enduring symbols of Waverly Hills. It embodies the sanatorium's grim reality that death was Not an exception, but an expectation. It reminds us that Waverly was not simply a place of healing. It was a place of endings. And when so many endings are funneled through one dark, concrete chute, perhaps it is inevitable that something remains, whether you believe in ghosts or not. The tunnel forces you to confront the horror of what happened at Waverly. Tens of thousands of men, women and children took their final journey down that slope, leaving behind whispers, shadows, and a sense of despair that no passage of time has erased. And so the tunnel waits, silent, dark, watching if the death tunnel was the symbol of Waverly's despair. Then the wards above it were the stage where daily life, or what passed for it, played out. To live inside Waverly Hills was to exist in a strange twilight world, where sickness was constant, hope was rare, and death was always waiting in the next room. For the patients each day followed a strict rhythm. Wake up to the sound of coughing echoing down the halls, meals brought on metal trays that rattled against the wheels of carts. Treatments administered at set hours, regardless of whether they brought comfort or pain. Children attended small classes held within the sanatorium, learning letters and numbers while coughing into their sleeves. Adults spent long hours in bed or on porches, staring out at the rolling Kentucky hills, but never allowed to return to them. Nurses and doctors moved briskly from room to room, balancing their duties with the weight of compassion fatigue. They worked in a place where victories were few and losses were overwhelming. Yet still, they pressed on, because for every dozen they lost, there might be one they saved. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Waverly was the children's ward. It was not just adults who contracted tuberculosis. Thousands of children fell ill, their small lungs filling with infection, their bodies too fragile to fight. Many were brought to Waverly, where their days were a mix of fleeting play and endless treatment. There were toys scattered across the floors, dolls, balls, wooden blocks, but the laughter of children often rang hollow, interrupted by fits of coughing. Some were so weak they could barely lift their heads from the pillows. Others, still full of restless energy, played gaze in the hallways until exhaustion overtook them. Nurses often grew attached to the children, becoming surrogate mothers to those who were too sick to see their families. But those bonds only made the inevitable more painful when a small body was wrapped in sheets and carried down to the tunnel. Even today, paranormal investigators report the sound of children's laughter echoing in the empty halls, a ball bouncing across the floor, a little voice calling out, though no living child remains. Isolation was one of the cruelest realities of Waverly Hills. Patients were cut off from their families, sometimes for years. Letters were censored for fear of spreading false hope or despair. Visits, when allowed, were short and often heartbreaking. Parents would look at their children from across glass dividers. Husbands and wives touched hands through barriers. And every goodbye felt like it could be the last. Loneliness ate away at patients as much as the disease itself. Some gave up, refusing to eat, refusing to fight, their spirits broken by the endless waiting. Others clung to hope with a desperate intensity, believing that one day they would walk out of Waverly alive. But for most, the sanatorium became their entire world. Its walls, its windows, its endless corridors, they were the boundaries of existence. And within those boundaries, life became a ritual of survival. For the staff, life at Waverly was a strange contradiction. They were surrounded by death, yet expected to embody hope. They witnessed countless last breaths, yet still had to comfort the next patient with a smile. Some nurses described feeling numb after a few years, hardened against the suffering around them. Others admitted they broke down often, unable to contain the weight of their grief. It was said that nurses were more likely to fall into depression at Waverly than at any other hospital in Kentucky. And yet, despite the despair, many staff members felt a strange loyalty to the sanatorium. They believed they were doing important work, that even if they couldn't save everyone, their care brought dignity to those in their final days. Life at Waverly Hills was not all darkness. There were moments of joy, even in the shadow of death. Patients celebrated birthdays with small cakes. Nurses organized games and movie nights. Holidays were marked with decorations and carols echoing down the halls. These small flickers of normalcy gave patients the strength to endure. But they also created memories that lingered long after death. Paranormal investigators often report hearing music in the halls, the faint notes of a piano or a Christmas carol playing in an otherwise silent building. It's as though the fragments of daily life are still playing out in some parallel loop, echoes of laughter, of music, of conversations that ended decades ago. Ask anyone who has stepped inside Waverly Hills, even today, and they will tell you the same thing. The building feels alive. It's not just the architecture though, the Gothic design, the looming staircases, and the endless rows of windows give it an intimidating presence. It's the energy, the feeling, that every wall, every floor, every shadow carries the weight of the lives once lived and lost inside. Back then, patients described it to. Some claimed to feel watched at night, even when no one was in the room. Others swore they heard voices whispering from empty hallways. A few even claimed to see figures, fleeting shadows, glowing forms lingering at the edge of their vision, whether born of sickness, imagination, or something far darker. These experiences only deepened the aura of Waverly Hills. In the end, life at Waverly was not truly life at all. It was existence in a liminal space caught between hope and despair, between the world of the living and the inevitability of death. For some, the sanatorium was a prison. For others, it was a final refuge. But for all, it was a place that demanded surrender to the routines, to the treatments, to the disease itself. And when you spend every day surrounded by death, when every hallway is haunted by loss, perhaps it is no surprise that the line between the living and the dead begins to blur at Waverly Hills. That line blurred long ago, and some say it has never been restored. Every haunted building has one. Room 1, place that becomes the epicenter of its legends, the heart of its darkness. For Waverly Hills, that room is 502, tucked away on the 5th floor, the level already infamous for its paranormal activity. Room 502 is whispered about in hushed tones by ghost hunters, staff, and even skeptics. It is a room where despair turned to tragedy, where lives ended by choice rather than by disease, and where, some believe, those restless souls still linger. The nurse who couldn't bear it died. First story dates back to the 1920s. A young nurse, just 29 years old, was found hanging from a light fixture in room 502. She had been working long shifts in the hospital, surrounded by sickness and death every day. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that weighed on her. Rumor has it she became pregnant, and in those days, being an unwed mother carried enormous stigma. To make matters worse, she may have contracted tuberculosis herself, a double curse in a place already drowning in tragedy, with no way out, no hope for her future. She tied a rope and ended her life in that lonely room. The discovery shocked the staff. Nurses whispered about it for years, warning newcomers about the sad girl of room 502. Patients claimed they sometimes saw her shadow pacing by the window, her form outlined against the night sky, and in death she became part of Waverly's legend. If one tragedy was enough to stain a room, room 502 had more to offer. In the 1930s, another nurse reportedly took her own life in that same cursed space. This time, she climbed to the roof outside the room and leaped to her death. Why she did it remains a mystery. Some say it was despair from working in the sanatorium too long. Others claim she too may have been sick. But whatever the reason, Her body was found broken on the ground below. 2 suicides within the same decade, within the same room. Coincidence, or something darker? From that moment on, room 502 was no longer just another hospital chamber. It was cursed, the atmosphere of room 502 even today. Those who step inside the room describe an overwhelming heaviness, a pressure in the chest, as though the air itself is too thick to breathe. Some report feeling sudden sadness, even thoughts of self-harm while standing inside. Others hear whispers, faint voices telling them to jump, to end it, to give in. Investigators have captured EVP's electronic voice phenomena in room 502. Recordings of chilling phrases like, "Get out, help me, she's here." One of the most unsettling accounts comes from a paranormal team that visited late one night. They left a motion sensor in the room and returned hours later to find it had been triggered repeatedly. Despite the room being locked, on playback, they swore they heard the faint creak of a rope swinging. Room 502 has large windows that overlook the hospital grounds. Patients and nurses alike reported seeing strange things there, shadows passing by when no one was inside, faces staring down at them from the glass. Some claim the original nurse who hung herself is still pacing those windows, waiting, trapped, in the very moment she ended her life. Others believe the suicides left behind a stain so strong that the room itself became a magnet for suffering, pulling in any wandering spirit. Visitors often refuse to linger there long. Tour guides say even the bravest ghost hunters sometimes step into room 502, only to immediately step back out, shaken by an unseen force. Room 502 is just one part of Waverly's 5th floor, but the entire level has a reputation of its own. The 5th floor was used for patients with advanced or dangerous stages of tuberculosis, some of whom suffered from TB of the brain, which caused hallucinations, paranoia, and violent behavior. To the staff, this floor was the most difficult to manage. To the patients, it was the most terrifying. Even today, investigators report an almost unbearable energy there. Shadow figures dart across hallways, doors slam shut when no one is near, cold spots chill the air, and sometimes the sound of footsteps can be heard pacing back and forth in the empty rooms. But none of it compares to the dread of room 502. Over time, stories about room 502 grew darker, more exaggerated. Some claimed the nurses were victims of something supernatural, driven mad by the spirits of the dead. Others suggested the room itself was cursed, that anyone who stayed too long inside would be compelled to take their own life. Of course, skeptics argue it was simply depression, exhaustion, and disease that drove those women to despair. But even skeptics admit to suicides in the same room, in the same building, already drowning in death, is an unsettling coincidence. And when you stand in room 502 today, with the silence pressing down on you, with the shadows dancing in the corners of your vision, you might find yourself wondering, did something in this room whisper to them? Did something unseen push them toward the edge? Whether cursed by coincidence, tragedy, or something far more sinister, room 502 remains one of the most haunted spots in America. Visitors leave with chills running down their spines, convinced they were not alone. Paranormal investigators call it one of the most active rooms they've ever encountered. And countless stories continue to emerge decade after decade about strange encounters tied to that one cursed chamber. Room 502 is more than just a story. It is the embodiment of Waverly Hills darkness, a reminder that the sanatorium was not just a place where disease killed, but where despair itself claimed lives. And perhaps that is why the room will never be silent, because despair has a way of lingering. And here, in room 502, despair is eternal. If Waverly Hills were a living creature, the 5th floor would be its beating heart of darkness. It wasn't just room 502 that carried a curse. The entire level, with its long corridors, empty wards, and silent isolation, radiates an energy that many describe as unbearable. To step onto the fifth floor is to step into the core of Waverly's legend, where shadows do not behave like ordinary shadows and where something darker seems to lurk. Waiting. Historically, the fifth floor was reserved for tuberculosis patients whose illness had advanced too far, or for those whose mental health had collapsed under the weight of disease. TB could spread to the brain, causing hallucinations, paranoia, and violent episodes. For this reason, the fifth floor was considered dangerous, not only because of the sickness, but because of the unpredictable behavior of those confined there. Locked doors, barred windows, and constant screams became part of its routine. Today, the screams are gone, but the echoes remain. Visitors swear they hear faint cries from behind locked doors. Some claim to hear conversations in rooms that are completely empty. Others describe the unmistakable sensation of being followed, even when alone. Perhaps the most reported phenomenon on the fifth floor is the presence of shadow figures, not the fleeting tricks of the eye we sometimes mistake for movement, but full-bodied silhouettes that seem to walk, stand, and even interact with those who see them. Tour guides tell of guests screaming as a tall, human-shaped shadow darted across the hallway. Paranormal investigators report seeing shadows peeking around doorways as though curious before vanishing into thin air. Some describe them as darker than the darkness itself, a moving void that seems to swallow the dim light. One account tells of a group of visitors shining flashlights down the corridor. The beams illuminated a long dark figure standing in the middle of the hall. When the light passed over it, the figure did not vanish. It stood there unmoving, as though watching them. Only when they blinked did it finally dissolve into the darkness. Among all the apparitions of Waverly Hills, none is as terrifying as the creeper. Unlike the shadow figures that resemble human forms, the creeper is something else entirely. Witnesses describe it as a black, crawling mass that moves along walls, ceilings, and floors. It does not walk upright. It slithers, scuttles, and clings, moving like an insect or something far worse. Paranormal teams claim to have seen it crawling toward them, its form twisting unnaturally, its presence radiating pure malice. Some report collapsing to the ground in tears after encountering it, overwhelmed by feelings of dread and despair. Skeptics argue it could be a trick of light or the power of suggestion. But those who have seen the creeper insist there is no mistaking it. One witness swore that as it crawled across the ceiling above them, the temperature dropped so sharply they could see their breath. Another claimed they felt claws brush against their shoulder before it disappeared. The creeper has no known origin, no tie to any specific patient or nurse. And perhaps that is what makes it so horrifying. It may not be a human spirit at all. Some believe it is a non-human entity, something born of the suffering that saturated Waverly Hills, feeding on despair, growing stronger with every death. What unnerves visitors most about the fifth floor isn't always what they see, but what they feel. Unlike the lower levels, which echo with faint sounds, the squeak of phantom gurneys, the laughter of ghostly children, the fifth floor is heavy with silence. It's the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, that makes your heart pound louder, that convinces you something is just out of sight, waiting. People report dizziness and nausea upon entering. Some feel sudden rage or sadness, emotions not their own. Others leave after only a few minutes, refusing to go back. It is as though the fifth floor itself rejects the living. One paranormal team recounted an investigation where they placed motion detectors in the hallway. As they stood at one end, the sensors at the far end began to go off, one after another, as if something invisible was walking toward them. They heard footsteps. They saw a tall, dark shadow advancing. Then before their eyes, the detectors stopped. The footsteps ceased, and the shadow melted into nothingness. Another visitor reported hearing a child's laughter on the fifth floor, high-pitched and playful, only to remember that this floor had no children's ward. When they turned to leave, they felt something cold grab their hand, as if a small child had taken it. But when they looked down, no one was there. The fifth floor offers no comfort, no peace. It offers only questions and fear. Some believe the fifth floor is so haunted because it concentrated not only sickness, but madness. Patients here weren't just dying, they were losing themselves. Their screams, their paranoia, their violent ends may have left an imprint so strong it transcended death itself. Others argue it's the suicides, particularly in room 502, that cursed the level. Despair, after all, leaves deep scars. And then there are those who whisper that the creeper is proof of something else entirely, that Waverly Hills, and especially its fifth floor, became a breeding ground for something beyond human understanding. Something dark, something inhuman, something born of collective suffering. Whatever the truth, the fifth floor remains the most feared part of Waverly Hills. Not even the bravest investigators enter without caution. Because here, shadows move with purpose. Here, silence speaks louder than screams. And here, something waits in the darkness, watching every step. Waverly Hills Sanatorium may have closed its doors to patients decades ago, but in many ways, the building has never been busier. Today, it is one of the most famous haunted locations in the United States, drawing thrill seekers, paranormal investigators, and documentary crews from all over the world. What they find inside is more than just dust, broken glass, and crumbling walls. They find evidence, or at least compelling experiences, that suggest the spirits of Waverly's past are still very much alive. The rise of ghost hunting at Waverly in the late 20th century, as Waverly Hills fell into ruin, stories about its hauntings began to circulate more widely. Locals whispered about strange lights on the fifth floor, about sounds echoing through the abandoned halls at night. Teenagers dared each other to break in, only to run out terrified by what they saw or heard. By the early 2000s, as paranormal TV shows exploded in popularity, Waverly became a centerpiece. It was featured on Ghost Hunters, Most Haunted, Scariest Places on Earth, and later, Ghost Adventures. Each show added fuel to the legend, capturing moments that both stunned audiences and convinced many that Waverly was the real deal. Tour groups followed, then overnight investigations, and eventually, Waverly Hills transformed into both a historical landmark and a paranormal playground. Electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, one of the most chilling forms of evidence, comes from EVPs, electronic voice phenomena. Investigators leave audio recorders running in empty rooms, only to play them back later and hear voices that were never heard in real time. At Waverly, these voices are plentiful. Whispers of "help me," a child's laugh, a man's gruff voice saying, "get out." One investigator claimed to capture a full sentence, "They won't let us leave." The most famous EVP, captured in the death tunnel, recorded a voice calling out a member of the team's name, even though no one in the group had spoken it aloud. Skeptics argue it could be stray radio interference or the power of suggestion. But those who've heard the recordings firsthand describe a chill running down their spine, convinced they are hearing the trapped voices of Waverly's dead. Visual evidence is just as chilling. Countless photographs taken inside Waverly's show, figures that shouldn't be there. One famous image shows what appears to be a young girl standing in a doorway, translucent, with hollow eyes. She has been nicknamed Mary, and many believe she was once a child patient at Waverly. Another widely circulated photo shows a tall shadow standing at the end of a hallway, with its arms stretched unnaturally long. Paranormal investigators insist no one was in the building at the time. Thermal cameras have also picked up human-shaped heat signatures moving through empty rooms. On one occasion, a heat signature was recorded walking into a wall and disappearing. And then there's the video footage. Teams have captured doors slamming shut on command, wheelchairs rolling across hallways on their own, and even lights flickering in patterns that seem to respond to questions. Perhaps the most famous interactive phenomenon at Waverly involves a simple toy ball. Visitors often bring a ball into the children's ward and roll it across the floor. Time and again, the ball rolls back as if pushed by invisible hands. Some skeptics suggest the uneven floors cause the ball to roll on its own, but multiple investigators claim to have seen balls change direction mid-roll or stop suddenly as if grabbed. Others swear they've heard children's laughter as the ball moved. It's one of Waverly's most well-documented hauntings, and one that has convinced even hardened skeptics that something unexplainable lingers in those halls. While shadow people are often caught on camera, one entity has terrified investigators like no other. The Creeper. Several paranormal groups claim to have captured footage of a dark, crawling shape moving along the walls and ceilings. In one case, night vision cameras recorded a black mass dropping from the ceiling and slithering across the floor toward the team, before vanishing into the shadows. Those who have witnessed it say no piece of video does justice to the terror of seeing it in person. The sense of dread it inspires is almost physical, like being crushed under the weight of an unseen force. Some investigators even refuse to return to Waverly after encountering the Creeper, convinced it is something inhuman beyond recordings and photographs. Perhaps the most convincing evidence comes from the sheer number of personal accounts. Tour guides, visitors, and professional investigators alike tell eerily similar stories. Footsteps pacing the halls when no one is there, voices whispering their names, sudden cold drafts that make their breath visible, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. One guide recalls locking up after a night tour, only to hear someone humming a lullaby in the children's ward. When she checked, the room was empty, but the humming continued until she fled. Another visitor described walking through the death tunnel when a hand grabbed their wrist. They spun around to find no one there, but red marks remained on their skin for hours afterward. When so many unrelated people report the same experiences, it becomes harder to dismiss them all as imagination. Of course, not everyone is convinced. Skeptics argue that Waverly's atmosphere is enough to make anyone feel uneasy. The power of suggestion, they say, explains the voices, shadows, and cold chills. Old buildings creak, drafts move through cracks, and our minds play tricks when primed to expect ghosts. But even skeptics struggle to explain some of the most compelling evidence. How do you explain names whispered on EVP's answers to direct questions, or objects moving against gravity? And perhaps that is why Waverly remains so powerful. It straddles the line between history and horror, science and the supernatural. It offers enough tangible evidence to make believers certain, and enough mystery to make skeptics doubt their own logic. Today, Waverly Hills is considered one of the most haunted places on Earth. Paranormal evidence continues to pile up, from new recordings to fresh eyewitness accounts. Every investigation seems to add another layer to the legend. Another reason to believe that Waverly Hills is more than just an abandoned hospital, and perhaps the greatest evidence of all is the building itself. Step inside and you don't need cameras or recorders to feel it. The weight of thousands of deaths, the despair of countless patients, the lingering energy of nurses and doctors, it's in the walls, the floors, the very air. Evidence doesn't just prove Waverly is haunted. Waverly proves it to you the moment you cross its threshold. Waverly Hills is more than just a crumbling building in Kentucky. It has become a symbol, a mirror reflecting America's darkest fears. When people talk about Waverly Hills, they are not just talking about ghosts. They are talking about death, despair, and the fragile line between hope and horror. But why does this place, more than so many others, continue to haunt our imagination? A monument to death first. There is the sheer scale of tragedy. At its height, Waverly Hills was home to hundreds of patients at once. Some historians estimate that over 50,000 people may have died within its walls. Whether that number is exact or exaggerated, the reality remains. Thousands of lives ended here. Every hallway, every room, every brick carries the weight of that loss. It is impossible to stand inside without feeling the enormity of it. Unlike other hospitals where patients left healed, Waverly was a place where most never left at all. The building is a monument to death, not as a single event, but as a constant presence. And in America, where we often avoid talking about death, places like Waverly become the stage where we confront it. Waverly also taps into something deeply human, the fear of isolation. Patients who entered the sanatorium were cut off from their families, sometimes for years. They lived in a closed world, their entire reality defined by disease and waiting. For many, Waverly was not just a hospital, it was a prison, a place where loneliness became unbearable. Today, when we imagine those endless days of isolation, it awakens our own fears. We wonder what it would feel like to be forgotten in such a place. To hear your name called not by loved ones, but by doctors and nurses preparing to send you down the death tunnel. That fear of being abandoned, of dying, alone is one we all share. Waverly Hills embodies it. There is also the suffering itself. Tuberculosis was called the White Plague not only because of its death toll, but because of the way it ravaged the body. Patients coughed until they bled, starved from malnutrition, and endured treatments that were sometimes as cruel as the disease. Every scream that echoed down Waverly's halls left an imprint. Every last breath carried a story in many ways. Waverly Hills is haunted not because of ghosts, but because of the very human energy of suffering that saturated it. Even skeptics agree, emotions leave marks, and few places in America concentrate it. So much despair in one place. Waverly also survives in our imagination because it is cinematic. Its looming Gothic structure, its endless corridors, its death tunnel, all look like they were built to host a horror story. When filmmakers and ghost hunters walk through, the building itself seems to whisper, "Tell my story." And so they do, in documentaries, in books, in whispered stories around campfires. The more stories are told, the stronger the legend grows. Every photograph, every EVP, every shadowy figure caught on camera adds another layer. Today, Waverly is not just a real building, it is a living myth, as much a part of American folklore as the Salem witch trials or the lost colony of Roanoke. Why we return to Waverly, but the real question is, why do people keep coming back? Why do thousands of tourists, investigators, and thrill seekers willingly step into this place of death and despair? The answer lies in the paradox of fear. We are terrified of death, of ghosts, of suffering, yet we are drawn to them. In Waverly Hills, we get to confront those fears in a controlled way. We step into the dark, knowing we can step back out. We listen for whispers, knowing we are safe among our tour group. We face the terror, not to be destroyed by it, but to feel alive because of it. Waverly offers something rare, a direct line to the unknown. For some, it is proof of the afterlife. For others, it is a thrilling brush with fear. For all, it is unforgettable. Today, Waverly Hills is protected by preservation groups who recognize its dual importance, both as a historical site and as one of the world's most famous haunted locations. It is no longer just a decaying relic. It is a living legend, kept alive by every tour, every documentary, every whisper in the night. And perhaps that is why Waverly will never die, Because as long as we fear death, as long as we wonder about ghosts, as long as we are fascinated by the darkness of history, Waverly Hills will continue to haunt us. It is not just the spirits of the dead that keep the building alive. It is us, the shadows that never left us. We step back from the crumbling halls of Waverly Hills. One truth becomes impossible to ignore. This place is more than stone, steel, and broken windows. It is a graveyard built above the ground, a labyrinth, where history and horror bleed into one another, where the suffering of the past has carved itself into the very air. Think about it, tens of thousands of patients, men, women, and even children, once walked through these corridors. Most never walked out. Their voices, their cries, their last breaths, they linger, echoing through eternity. And while the world outside moved on, Waverly Hills never did. That is why, when you stand at the entrance of the death tunnel, you feel more than just a chill. You feel the weight of countless souls, all moving in one direction, down, away from life, into the unknown. Waverly Hills is haunted because it was always haunted, not by spirits at first, but by despair itself. Imagine being a patient, there, knowing every cough might be your last, watching friends disappear into the tunnel, knowing you'd be next. And then imagine being a nurse, forced to watch death after death, knowing there was no cure, no hope, only more suffering. For some, like the nurses in room 502, the weight became too much. This is why Waverly lingers in our imagination. It is not simply a building where ghosts appear. It is a building where hopelessness itself took shape, where despair became so thick, so heavy, that it never left. If ghosts are real, if spirits truly walk among us, then Waverly Hills is exactly where you'd expect to find them. Not every soul moves on peacefully. Some are tethered by fear, by unfinished business, or by the trauma of their final moments. The patients of Waverly didn't die in peace. They died in fear, in pain, in loneliness, and that energy is still here. That is why shadows walk the 5th floor. That is why whispers fill the children's ward. That is why investigators still hear cries in the night. Even the skeptics admit something lingers, whether it is spirits or the memory of suffering burned into the walls. Waverly Hills is alive in ways it should not be. But Waverly Hills isn't just a ghost story. It is also a mirror, showing us the darkest sides of humanity. It reminds us of a time when sickness was a death sentence, when science had no answers, and when society's solution was to hide away the dying. It shows us how fragile life can be, how easily hope can vanish, and how quickly despair can take its place. And perhaps most importantly, it forces us to ask questions we're afraid to answer. What happens when we die? Do we move on peacefully? Or do we remain behind, trapped by fear, forced to replay our pain again and again? If Waverly Hills is any clue, the answer is not comforting. The final walk through the death tunnel. Picture yourself one last time at the top of the death tunnel. The air is damp. The stairs descend into darkness. You hear water dripping, echoing off the stone walls. And somewhere in that blackness, you feel the weight of thousands of footsteps. Some of those footsteps belonged to the dead, carried down in secret. Others, perhaps, belonged to the living who walked in and never came back out. And maybe, just maybe, some of those footsteps still walk beside you, because once you enter Waverly Hills, you are never truly alone. So ask yourself this: why are we so fascinated by places like Waverly Hills? Why do we keep telling these stories, visiting these rooms, shining flashlights into the dark? It's because deep down, we are looking for proof. Proof that death is not the end. Proof that something of us remains. Proof that the fears we whisper about at night are not just in our imagination. And Waverly Hills gives us that proof, or at least the illusion of it, because when you hear a child's laughter in an empty room, when you see a shadow cross the hallway, When you feel cold fingers brush your arm in that moment, you know you are standing at the edge of the unknown. And that, my friends, is why Waverly Hills Sanatorium remains one of the most chilling places in America. A cursed asylum, a monument to suffering, and perhaps one of the few places where the line between the living and the dead is still crossed every single night. Now, I'll leave you with one haunting question. If thousands of souls are truly trapped inside Waverly Hills, do you think they want to be found, or do you think they're warning us to leave? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you believe. Was it despair that left this place haunted, or something far more sinister? And if you're brave enough to keep exploring America's darkest untold history with me, make sure you hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and turn on notifications, because the next story may be even darker than this one. Until then, sleep well. And if you hear footsteps in the dark tonight, don't be so sure you're alone.